webinar specifically about how companies are leveraging Mexico into their global supply chain strategy. We've got a full house today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I know we got a hard stop in 1 hour, and we got a lot to cover. Just on a point of housekeeping, for those companies, for those people who want to ask questions, please click on the question box. It'll come to me, and I'll ask the 3 speakers. We're going to be taking questions throughout the whole slides, so please feel free to ask them. We've got a full house today, so if you've got individual questions you want to get to, and we can't answer them, we'll get to you after the webinar. Okay, on slide 2 here, I just want to kind of cover with you kind of the introduction of how we're going to do this. We've got, we'll have a brief discussion on East, West, and speakers. We're going to talk about why Mexico, and then we're going to get into a discussion here. In order to address the question of how you best leverage Mexico in your global supply chain, we kind of broke it down into key points about why Mexico, what's the rationale for the reason why we're having this webinar, but the rationale for using Mexico and how do you best leverage it? What are the current challenges they've got, companies are having using Mexico? What's the future? The goals, how to do it. We'll have a very brief discussion on trade definitions for the USMCA, but I promise that this is not a compliance class, right? We're going to very lightly hit it just so you understand the concept. And then we got 3 existing case studies of companies and how they have done and how they are leveraging. As we start looking at just a brief introduction of East West, East West is simply, we're an operations consulting firm. We've got one qualification for the people that work at East West, and that is they've all had to hold senior management positions. They had to have P&L responsibilities. They had to run Western companies on the ground in our 5 markets, right, which is China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Europe, and the US. But all the people at East West have all had to build their own supply chain bases, develop supply chain strategies to service a global customer base. We've got, as you can see, we got 4 core services. The first is around corporate strategy for supply chain, corporate strategy for manufacturing. We've got oftentimes used in developing that corporate strategy to create a better access to our client base through diversification of supply chain, through diversification of manufacturing. On the commercial side, that's related to what we're doing for companies on the top line growth. On the operational side, got all aspects of running and manufacturing operation, whether it is developing suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier improvement, but it's all about building out supplier strategies. We also build factories, move factories, have an executive search program, but it's all aspects, all operational aspects of running a company. And then the final is risk management, and that's primarily our M&A practice and supply chain risk management. We have a team of ex-policemen, ex-military that do a lot of background checks on suppliers, because we have cases where companies will hire from a supplier and look several different suppliers and thinking they're these suppliers are all independent, only to find out that these suppliers are owned by one investor, one family. So those are our 4 core areas, and the team we have come from a variety of companies here in the U.S., but they all had P&L responsibilities for running their companies on the ground. Here's our core practice areas, but again, we're going to be focused today really about the strategic business planning and the supply chain optimization. The core areas all dovetail into our areas of practice around corporate strategy, commercial development, operational, and risk management. We have the areas where we operate: the U.S., we operate in China, operating in Mexico, operating in Europe, and operating in Southeast Asia. And we do have core practice areas in several areas, particularly automotive and chemicals. So I will take now the time, and I'm going to introduce the different corporate speakers. The first speaker is going to be Stefan Lochner, Senior Automotive Specialist, East West. Stefan, if you would take over.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you heard, my name is Stefan Lochner, and I'm German. And with my engineering background, I was working for more than 30 years within or for the automotive industry. The last 22 years of that, I have my home base in Mexico, creating and executing manufacturing strategies for electronics, plastic injection molding, and steel. And with this, I was building up plants, closing down plants, moving product to China, from China to Mexico. So vast experience in this area. And with this said, I would like to hand over to Dan.
Hi, this is Dan McLeod. I've been with East West for about 4 years now, doing projects in Asia, Mexico, and Central Europe in that time. Prior to that, spent the majority of my career in operations management, manufacturing, engineering, project management, capital expansions, primarily in the chemical industry, but also in food processing, a little bit of pharma, and some in the electronics industry. 21 years living and working in Asia, 13 of that in China, the balance in Southeast Asia, including regional operations management, as well as running factories in Southeast Asia. Mark?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So I'm somewhat similar. I've been with East West about 8 years now. Most of my career was in Asia, starting out in 1990 in Thailand with American Standard Train Air Conditioning, and then spinning up from 90 to roughly 2014, ending up as a president of Briggs and Stratton Asia out of Shanghai, running a fairly large business. So really good understanding of building and running businesses in Asia, and subsequently based on the China situation changing a little bit, we've picked up a lot of projects and work and experience now in Central Eastern Europe and of course Mexico. So long time Asia hand. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you, Mark. Okay, now we're going to look at kind of the question of why Mexico. So, Mark, I'm going to turn over to you to kind of address
Sure,
that.
sure, yeah. Next slide, please. So, I mean, everyone knows, I mean, on this call has probably been in and around China for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And well, what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 years? Well, we all know we went to China when labor rates were one thing in 1990. Now we have rising labor rates. Next bullet, please, Alex. And then what's happened also is labor rates have been going up, growing regulatory complexity. When we first went to China, it was pretty easy to do business. It's gotten much more complicated. What's happened? We Western companies have put a lot of Chinese businesses in competition with us by the fact of lack of some protections. With Xi Jinping has really put up a China 25 policy, really kind of buy China policy. That's been changing. Now what's happened recently since 2017 with the increased tariffs coming from China to the USA has had a big impact. Of course, COVID, what's that done? It's really stopped the ability for us to go to visit our companies and do due diligence, introduce new products, do audits. Can't travel there. Now and most recently, a $3,000 container 5 years ago is now a $17,000 to $20,000 container. If you can get one, in your times on the water have gone from like 6 weeks to 16 to 20 weeks. So the environment has changed dramatically in the last 13 to 15 years in China. Next slide, please. So why Mexico? Well, particularly if your business in China was to come back to the United States, it's really its location is phenomenal. Location USA and North America markets, and then with the USMCA, really a large free market. It's the growth of Mexico. Mexico was really strong, and then China sucked a lot of the business away 10, 15 years ago. Mexico is really coming back now because they see a tremendous opportunity that they have vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis what we just talked about is changing in China. The supply base is getting better in areas. Now, guys will talk later. It's not in all aspects where China is, but it's moving in the right direction, and being right on our border gives it tremendous advantages. The labor base and skills, labor costs are at China or even a little bit less. Skills in some area are as good. Skills in some area, quite frankly, aren't as good. So you have to really work with your suppliers to get them up to your standards. Next thing is we have a trade agreement. It's not arbitrary. People just can't put duties on, take duties off, change this, change that. We have trade agreements, ratified by the U.S. Congress. So you know what you're getting into. And then of course it's in these trade agreements, if you do it correctly, and we're going to talk about that, there's you can get away from all the tariffs coming in, the 25% tariffs from the USA coming into pardon me, China coming into the USA. So anyways, I'm going to turn this over to Dan now, and Dan's going to talk about really the rationale and the purpose of this webinar.
Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
So yes, what do we want to talk about today, and why do we want to talk about it? Well, East West, we are talking a lot with customers, clients that are interested in evaluating their opportunities to make changes in their global supply chain, make changes in their manufacturing strategies, really revisit decisions that were made years ago, particularly around sourcing overseas, and are looking at moving closer to home. You know, the big potential, as we mentioned, is, you know, we talked a little bit about the increasing complexity and difficulty and challenges of working in China, which drives a lot of it. But on the other side of the world, when you talk about logistics and time zone and travel restrictions, certainly the last few years. So getting closer to home, looking at Mexico as an option, particularly if your market's in North America, the US, and which is a key focus for most of the companies we talk to. What we find and what the reality is that many companies are going to be faced with continuing a relationship and a supply base in China. And the challenge is to try to optimize that mix, what to continue to source and produce in China, and what to localize or regionalize to serve a North American market. This allows companies, if done deftly, it allows you to take advantage of an existing supplier base, the years of time you've put into developing your supplier base on the other side of the world, but reduce the reliance on that and build up a supplier base closer to home. Now, the three major strategies that we talk with people about are one, the more basic approach is sourcing components or finished goods that's essentially local content out of Mexico, and this for consumption in the US. And this could be a lot. We talked to a lot of customers in the metals industries, for example, so castings, machine goods services, and machine parts, where you've got a well-established supplier base in Mexico and good technical capabilities. And so you're talking with somebody that can essentially move that component supply from overseas to Mexico. Then is sort of a hybrid model where you're looking at purchasing a finished product or a component that may have local content from Mexico, but also imported content from China consumption in the US. So again, you've developed a supplier base, or you can't at this point find a supplier base capable in North America. So you're faced with having to continue some portion of that imported from China or overseas, but want to maximize local content to take advantage of the USMCA trade arrangements. And at the same time, reducing your logistics costs, your tariff costs, and your working capital exposure to have those long supply lines. And then finally, the more complicated, the more time-consuming, really the leaping into the deep end of the pool is the setting up subcontracting and manufacturing in Mexico, where you're utilizing local content in terms of material, labor, utilities, space, factory overheads, logistics, transportation, in addition probably to imported components from China and elsewhere. Again, this is a significant undertaking, but more and more companies are finding that this is an opportunity for them and are evaluating this as part of their supply chain. Certainly you've got advantages on logistics, responsiveness, time to the marketplace, but you're faced with challenges of establishing a whole operation still, and the complexity associated with that. So those are three areas that we frequently talk to people.
Hey, Dan, before we jump forward, we got someone sending a question. Individual is in the electronic sector, and they're talking about how they can, within Mexico, there's not a very fully established electronic sector. They've got them in PCBs, but he said, you know, he's currently sources out of Asia, Southeast Asia, I'm assuming Thailand and Philippines, and he wants to know do we have any kind of thoughts, or when do we see the electronic sector? And this would be not for automotive electronics, but for electronics like PCB boards. When do they see a further development in Mexico of that industry? Do we have any thoughts on that?
I think it'll be I think for sort of basic electronic components that are, I think it'll be a long time before that's developed in North America and Mexico. The industry is well established as far as consumer electronics, as far as building the devices, but they're going to continue to be a great deal of the internals. For example, they're going to have to be imported. So you've got a well-developed industry for putting everything together, but it's still going to be some time before you can source all of the materials you need in North America. Having said that, we talk with clients that are increasing their component supplier base beyond China into Southeast Asia, Malaysia in particular. It gets a lot of discussion now to try to diversify the risk on that end.
And we had one other question. This sector in the medical field, and can you or Stefan or Mark talk about this? They currently source out of China using subcontractors for medical devices, medical textile products. They said they've had trouble finding the right suppliers in Mexico. And you've talked a little bit about that, about the difficulty of it. But they want to know, setting up subcontracting in Mexico for them has been difficult. Can you all speak to the challenges of doing that in Mexico versus this customer who's been in China for, looks like 8-9 years? Can one of you all address that, or all of you?
The medical. Sorry, Mark.
No, please, Stefan, please.
Okay. We can see that in the last years, I would say 5 years more or less, the medical sector increases in Mexico, the production of medical devices. But of course, there was a drain about 15 years ago towards China. So it will take some time to bring this knowledge back to Mexico.
Yeah, and all I was going to say is I think in certain cases you need to really be prepared to work with your new potential suppliers and bring them on. But that also can help endear you and get a strong relationship as you begin to bring some potential new suppliers on board. So it's a little bit of a teaching and a working methodology.
Great. All right.
And I believe Stefan's up next, going to talk about challenges for companies.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, and actually, the last question was quite a nice lead to this to this topic, because one of the challenges, or the biggest challenge, is that we have to overcome the immediate pressure of having simply good pricing from China or from anywhere else, yeah, versus establishing a long-term strategic solution. Yeah. So, which would require that the experience in identifying, qualifying stable and reliable supply base, which has been cut off and moved from Mexico to China 20 years ago. Yeah, and now the real challenge is to create the relationship again with suppliers, and this is becoming more and more important. Yeah. Then we have to understand also the impact of using imported components and raw materials on our cost structure, yeah, if we are moving into Mexico, to be able to leverage to use the leverage of the rules of the USMCA and the countries we are importing from. Yeah. And of course, to do this, we have to understand the culture and the business environment. Yeah. When establishing operation or subcontracting relationships. Yeah. It is not as fast as China, for example, and this has to be taken into account. So with this said, I would like to hand over to Dan, if there is no question.
Yeah, there is a question popped up. It's talking about, yeah, talked about, and we've mentioned before, around the difficulty of identifying quality, manufactured quality suppliers on the ground in Mexico, right? The difference between that and China. And then now it's a challenge because everybody in the world. Can you talk a little bit about, or all three of you will talk a little bit about why the challenge is so much more difficult in Mexico now to work with the suppliers than it was even pre-COVID?
Well, especially talking about qualifying the suppliers. If a whole business was pulled out of Mexico and moved to China many years ago, I remember around 2000, IBM and HP moved all the electronics production from Guadalajara to China. This was eliminating the possibility for Mexico to learn about these products and understand the business needs and the market. Now we have to reteach again, yeah? And I see this very much reflected in the automotive business. For everybody working in the automotive sector, it's very common to have certifications and to follow certain rules, yeah. And now you go to a supplier in Mexico who does injection molding, and he says, yeah, I can do this product, yeah, but you want some specific documents from the guy, and he simply does not know those, yeah. And you have to educate, yeah, and it will take some time for the suppliers to accept again requirements that were not present for many years now. And this is one of the most challenging situation, because you have to find those who would go the way with you, yeah? And you have to have the patience to do it. Does this
we
answer the question?
can move on. We had just another question around. We had a couple questions pop in, and again, for anyone who joined late, please send a question to us. We'll talk, but we've got a lot of people on today, so we may not get to every question. If we don't, we'll follow up with your question afterwards. But we just had a question pop in. One was about the content of products need to be sourced in Mexico for it to be deemed made in Mexico, and we're getting into that when we get to the case studies. But someone was just talking about specifically stainless steel fabrication, machining capabilities, and they want to know raw material availability for stainless steel and aluminum. Is there a pretty heavy availability of that in Mexico?
Not built in Mexico, imported into Mexico, and I think we are covering this with the case studies as well.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, we'll cover that here in just a minute.
Yeah, so I would hand over to Dan. Okay.
Okay. So think about the goal for companies. Really, it's around developing a supply chain strategy that compares and balances a number of options. One, you look for stability. In the last 2 years, so many companies have had, it's been a day-to-day battle facing disruptions, trying to schedule shipments, dealing with delays, dealing with power shutdowns in China, dealing with travel restrictions, dealing with all the variety of disruptions that are occurring. And so companies are looking for more stability, more predictability, more reliability. The comparison of landed costs and really a comprehensive comparison where it's not just out the door price, is becoming increasingly more common as the impact of freight, as the impact of increased inventories and delays in shipments of forcing companies to put more working capital in has really changed the equation around landed cost. Reducing dependence on China, and that could be whether it's just a matter of good business of having your eggs in multiple baskets, or whether there are serious geopolitical concerns. And we've certainly seen that in Europe in the last several weeks, where supply chains have been disrupted by conflict, and increasingly companies are concerned about a similar situation in Asia. And so bringing sourcing and operations closer to home into the region makes a lot of sense from a longer term geopolitical concerns. We mentioned rising labor costs in China. That's going to continue to impact operations there. And this contrasts to North American labor rates, although there's been some certainly inflation in the last year. Overall, labor rates in Mexico have been steady and predictable, and to the point where manufacturing labor costs are at or below what you see in the coastal, more developed areas of China. And finally, diversifying a supply chain base to ensure consistent supply of qualified raw materials. And we talked a little bit about bringing those suppliers closer to home, up to speed, whether understanding your requirements or getting the appropriate certifications or qualifications can be a challenge. But if you're in it for the long term, if you're in a long-term game, it can definitely pay off at the end. So, Stefan?
Yeah, Dan, before you go, we got another question popped up. It said the company is in the metals industry and they purchase castings and forgings. They've had some success finding suppliers on the ground in Mexico, but they want to know what are the relative quantity and capabilities of the raw material input suppliers in Mexico, like the steel mills and the smelters. Is there a trend, at least what's a future trend for primary and secondary metal suppliers in Mexico? Is that sector growing to be the castings and the forging sector?
There's certainly a lot of interest, and an area that's been a challenge, and we briefly started to touch upon it earlier, is the amount of interest in companies looking to source in Mexico, and that's somewhat overwhelming existing suppliers and creates a need to have a relationship with folks. And what we're seeing is less interest in smaller quantities, shorter runs, and to the extent that you can move more volume to create some interest in Mexico in your business is going to be critical. Suppliers are much more selective than they were a few years ago. And Stefan, you may also want to comment on that as well as what you've seen there.
And also you can comment a little bit about the basis right now of just having of the castings and the forgings and particularly in the steel and metal sector, what the growth of that looks like.
Yeah, the steel mill sector itself is not in a vast growth, we have to say, because there was a worldwide overcapacity, and we were basically swamped by steel from anywhere. Yeah, and this is not right now one of the primary sectors that's growing. The secondary, yes, yeah, meaning you have service centers laminating steel. You have business that are starting, a lot of business that is starting with stamping and casting and all these things. But those are being developed based on the business sector they are working for. You have it well developed for the automotive sector, for example. You have a lot of casting for the engine components, for example. Yeah, but everything that's more related to lower volume is suffering so far.
Right, and is there, and that's primarily on a, you're thinking for the next 2 to 3 years, that's going to be about, that situation is going to remain.
Yes. Yes, for sure, because those are long-term investments, yeah, and since Mexico does not have the market yet to supply into other business sectors than the high volume automotive, a little bit into the aviation sector so far, and appliances, but anything else but those three areas do not support creating new supply bases for especially in the steel sector.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, all right, well, now to turn over the trade definitions before we get the case studies. And again, just a reminder, we're not going to go deep on the trade definitions. It's not a compliance test. The audience that's here needs to know the basics. So, Stefan, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So yeah, this is actually a little bit related to the last question. Yeah, on the supply base and steel sector. We now talk about how to work around, yeah, because we have to import material, and we will shortly talk about PROSEC, rules of origin, regional content value, the methods how to calculate, and I will give you a summary just to understand how the case studies work out. Yeah, it's, as Alex said, no compliance training. Yeah, it's just to provide an overview. So, so PROSEC means promoted sectors. Yeah, PROSEC allows companies to import material or components for, at preferential duties, which is normally 0%, if they are working or supplying to specific promoted sectors in Mexico. Yeah? And this, of course, only applies for imports into Mexico. And currently we have 24 of those industry sectors that are being promoted, under which steel, automotive, chemicals, and electronics are the most prominent ones. Yeah. Which also answers part of the question, which ones they want to develop, but do not see the supply base yet to do everything within Mexico. Yeah. And just as an example, yeah, we can import Chinese auto components into the US, and then we possibly face US-China tariffs. We use the same Chinese auto component and import it into Mexico. Because it's an auto component, you are probably not paying any duty or tariff, yeah, due to the PROSEC, but it only applies if we add some additional value to it within Mexico in this sector, or if we build it into a car directly in Mexico. Yeah. Then the rules of origin. It's the concept that governs USMCA, which is permitting the duty-free trade of products that originate within US, Mexico, or Canada. Yeah. And this contract has product-specific rules to determine which or whether a particular product meets the requirements of originating. Yeah. And the whole purpose of the USMCA and the rules of origin is to encourage more trade between the USMCA countries, yeah, under specific rules. Next page, please.
Stefan, before you go on, we had another question, and it kind of dovetails into this whole conversation around trade within the U.S. and Mexico. It was talking about for you and Dan and Mark about they're asking logistics. They just got quoted some freight rate from Mexico to the U.S., it was they said it was $8,000 from the border currently, which seems to me excessively high. But for you and Mark, where do you all see kind of the freight rates coming from Mexico getting up to the border? Are the Mexican freight rates? I mean, they were increasing last year. Are those going to level out? Where do you all see that?
The last evaluations I did for some of my customers were that the freight rates are stabilizing at a very high level compared to previous years, and this is mainly related now to the gas prices, yeah, and to the increased demand on freight. So the market is pulling much more freight than could be managed right now.
Mm.
Yeah. There's an imbalance of trailers going into Mexico versus coming out. For years, it was a fair, in general, balance, and now there's a substantial shift so that logistics companies are forced to send a lot of empty trailers back there to pick up loads, and that adds to the cost as well.
Yeah, and that's makes good sense. And that's probably not going to change for the foreseeable future, although it's nowhere near what's still obviously vastly preferable costs coming out of China.
Yeah, and my personal opinion is, my personal experience is, if you have a year's contract with I don't know how many travels between a plant and the border, yeah, and a certain volume you are managing, you usually get very good prices, yeah, if it's calculable. But if you are asking, let's say, a type of spot buy of freight, yeah, then you are exposed to prices that might be 10 times higher than the long-term pricing.
Yeah, yeah, agreed, and we've seen that ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, I will move on with a regional content value. Yeah, that is a term describing whether a product qualifies for the trade benefits under USMCA, and that's basically the percentage of product value that is required for regional content. The regional content value differs significantly depending on the end product usage. We will see this clearly in our case studies. Yeah, and for example, for more protected industry sectors, and now looking into the US, the US is protecting automotive, steel, chemicals, and others. Yeah, and there we have a higher request on regional content value. Yeah, just to protect against significant imports. Yeah, and for the less protected industry sectors like appliances, that allows for lower regional content value, for example. Now, the transaction value method and the net cost method, those are two calculation methods that are used to determine if a product, a particular product, meets the regional content value. Yeah, and that's basically calculating the percentage of the regional content. And again, repeating, this webinar is not a class on compliance training. Yeah. But we need to know the basics to understand, and so we can determine how it will affect our supply chain strategy, yeah, and cost structure. Yeah. The net cost method evaluates the percentages of originating material, yeah, used to produce your goods. And the transaction value method leaves a little bit more freedom because some more costs can be added and increase potentially the regional content. Yeah. But the net cost value, the net cost method is applicable to every calculation we do. The transaction value method is only applicable to certain business sectors. So let's go to the summary. The USMCA allows the free trade of goods, yeah, between the three countries, yeah, if produced there, yeah. Second, there are various exemptions to these basic rules, yeah, for protected industry sectors like automotive electronics, steel, oil, gas, chemicals, etc. Yeah? So we have to look into it case by case. Yeah. A workaround for business sectors that do not have a supply base established in Mexico is PROSEC, yeah, which allows companies to import goods and materials into Mexico from any country in the world, yeah, often with a 0% duty. Yeah. And even if the goods are being assembled with imported components, there are possibilities to trade them tax-free between the USMCA countries. And this is related to the regional content. And some industries are more protected than others. And imported product will have a varying tariff code depending on the industry sector you're using the product at. This is to give the tax authorities a hint how much tax should be paid on this product. Okay, and with this said, I would hand over to Mark to do the first case study.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So, yeah, we're gonna go through 3 case studies, and we're gonna demonstrate what we've done, where where your industry and your application can change the same product to a different duty structure depending on how it's used. Next slide, please, Alex.
Yeah, and Mark, before we go, just a real quick question. It kind of dovetailed. Just got a question in. It said, in the absence of smaller quantities of basic steel in Mexico, it's pretty straightforward to source steel in the U.S. and send it down to Mexico. Is that has not been an issue? Obviously,
Well, that's right, and that's frankly, as you'll see, our first basic case study that we've done was just that. As Stefan said, the steel industry is a global industry, and it's the capacity is huge. So you don't need to have a steel mill next to every place where you're producing, right? So in this case, we've had clients who were bringing steel tubes in, you know, from the China into the USA and paying the duties. You take those same steel tubes now and have them, you know, shipped from the USA into Mexico, or find them in Mexico where the application's already been done. You've got 100% local regional content, you know, whether it's USA, Canada, Mexico. So again, and then you begin to fabricate and however you want to. So that one's a pretty basic, straight moving a source component or a raw material from China to Mexico and be able to avoid the 25% tariffs. So I'm sorry, Stefan's going to talk next about another case study, which is a little more complicated, using the same steel tube thought process. Stefan?
Before we jump forward, another question popped in that said, when we're talking about tax-free, does that mean that that the U.S. importers don't pay the VAT taxes between the U.S. and Mexico and Canada? If you're sending, in this case, Mark, we're producing tubes down in Mexico and then sending them to the U.S., there's no VAT tax that you've got to pay on that. under the U.S.
Well,
That it's allowed.
yeah, I mean, the main tax we were talking about, the tariffs, of course, was from China, to USA, and then on the VAT, depending on the industry, you typically draw that back.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, now if we move to the next slide, yeah, let's look into the same product, yeah, steel tubes that are being produced, stainless steel tubes that are being produced in Mexico, and we use this knowing that you would ask for it. I think the material is not available in Mexico. Yeah, there is no producer of stainless steel in Mexico. We have modification of stainless steel in Mexico, but like rolling it into or laminating the steel and so on, but not producing it. So it has to come from somewhere, and in this case, we just said it comes from China or Korea, South Korea, wherever, yeah, and we import it under PROSEC, yeah, because we are working in the steel industry or in the automotive or whatsoever, yeah, but steel is driving here, and we can import with 0% duties into Mexico. Then we add value, and if we look into the blue box, yeah, we just took the assumption 35% of our costs is the material without transport and anything. It's only the material, and 65% we add as value. Now, going back into the USMCA rules. If we look into the rules for appliances, we need to comply with 50% regional content of the product, and with the 65% we reached, we comply with all the rules to import from Mexico to the US tax-free. And just to give you an information about the numbers I put behind the sentences, these numbers are the tariff codes which are being used to import into the US these specific steels, yeah, or steel tubes. So for appliance, 50%, no tax to be paid. Then we look into the automotive aftermarket for exhaust systems, muffler, for example. We have a specific steel tube used for muffler, and we have to reach 50% regional content. We have 65, so we do not pay any tax moving it from Mexico to the US. We are using the same tube for the heavy truck industry, yeah, and we have to reach 60% regional content. With our 65, we are done, no tax applies. Yeah. We can use the same tube specifically for the oil and gas industry, yeah, and we have to have a 65% regional content already. We have it, so we pay no tax. Yeah. But then we are selling it to the automotive industry in the USA for passenger car use, but not for chassis. Yeah. There we have to have a 70% local content, and we only have 65. So this one would not comply with the regional content necessary to be imported without tax. And for the chassis use of the same passenger car, the same tube would even need 75% regional content. So the takeaway here is exactly the same tube can have different tariff codes, and this depends on the industry sector you're using the product in. Yeah. And with this said, to have another example, in the electronics business, I would like to hand over to Dan.
Thanks, Stefan. So, we want to talk a bit about the electronics sector, where, we've seen a number of challenges. And as I think we talked about earlier, much of the componentry, the key components used in electronic equipment devices are still based in Asia and China as a strong, broad, and deep supply chain basis. And many manufacturers are going to be faced with having to continue to source from that geography for several years to come until you see more growth of a regional manufacturing supply chain. Well, that's not all lost, but you need to carefully look at the value add and your manufacturing processes. So if you look at an example that we've chosen here, we would assume that we're looking at a 35% imported component and complete the manufacturing. It could be labor, could be other materials sourced within Mexico, the utilities, your factory overheads and expenses. And so we're maintaining a 35% import component, 65% local. So again, similar to the case we talked about previously on the stainless steel tubes, you've got different requirements for different end markets. For industrial use, you can import and use tariff-free. Consumer electronics, that hurdle's closer is 40%, somewhat higher, but still very manageable in most cases. For a bus, lower 60%, and passenger cars currently 67.5%. So that's quite a hurdle rate, and we require you to source more and put more value in domestically. And comment on that. That's a transitional rate where 2 years ago that was 60%, and that's moving to 75% in the next year. So again, it's going to force more and more assembly work and local sourcing and components to be able to comply with U.S. MCA requirements. So it's very much, again, a focus on which sector and understanding which sector you're selling into and what the application is. With that, Alex, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
All right. So before we do, got a couple questions that popped in on that last one. The question was for the protected industries on electronics, right? You've got electronic, like for automotives, those are going to be more protected. Less protected are going to be like consumer electronics. That'd be fair, Stefan. I think that's
Yes.
That's pretty fair.
Sorry, I was on mute. I answered yes, but nobody heard me. So that's a fair statement. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the point here, we're gonna as we wrap up here, there was the point of looking at this is that there are just kind of several core conclusions we just want to address. One is that obviously why Mexico, we talked about earlier, given everything that's going on in China with the travel restrictions, labor costs, logistical costs, we know what's going on in just recently in Shanghai and Shenzhen, where they've had further lockdowns because of COVID. It's making China a much more difficult place to operate. In addition to all the other things that have occurred previously, and we now know we've had some rolling blackouts in China. Given that situation in China, we don't see companies leaving China. They're going to keep that diversification there, keep that client base there, the list of customers, but they are diversifying into other places, and Mexico is a prime one because of the location here, right? And when they're diversifying their global supply chain, the manufacturing here, better service their customers in the U.S. North America. What we're seeing, those that are doing it more successfully, coming and diversifying the supply chain from into Mexico, they're doing a couple of things. One is it's not just going out and finding products in Mexico and here. They're trying to see if there's real availability of Mexican supply chain base. And Mexico is not China, right? We got a question that just popped up here around how does Mexico compare to China as far as the breadth of logistics, as far as the ports, as far as just the very base of it. And Mexico is not China. Mexico's 250 million people. China's 1.4 billion. There are parts of the Mexican economy, from automotive, electronics, medical, fabrication, where Mexico has done very well and is really strong in the areas. There are other areas where, when we've done sourcing, and our Mexican team was sourced, they're not going to find products nearly as competitive in Mexico compared to China, just because they don't have the depth and the breadth of product that has been needed in the past. But Mexico is making some improvements. So Mexico is a fit, but it's not it's not a replacement for China. However, what they are doing is the USMCA does help both for U.S. and suppliers and U.S. manufacturing companies, because it does, in a lot of cases, it allows companies who have an established supply chain in China to bring products into Mexico with no duties, right? And then have the value add on to Mexico, produce with Mexican content or U.S. content. And that's a pretty significant thing. So it allows you to diversify and still bring in imported products from China as part of your regional content value. You can bring them in. You've got better, obviously, logistical costs coming up from Mexico, and the USMCA is helping that. So we see companies taking kind of a more holistic approach to looking at Mexico and evaluating their total supply chain. And Dan spoke on it earlier about logistics costs and the cost of there's a cost of having freight on the water coming in from China. Companies are now taking a much more holistic approach. Before I go forward to the final two, there was another question that popped up just talking about the labor rates in Mexico. And if Dan or Mark or Stefan, if you all see those labor rates increasing substantially like they have been in China, or do you think the Mexico labor rate is a pretty consistent? Because that's obviously going to affect the price coming out of Mexico.
Mexican labor rate is very consistent if we are looking on a US dollar base, because usually the increases are outweighed by inflation in Mexico on the peso. So we see a very, very moderate growth, or even in some years decline of the labor rate.
Yeah, a major difference is, as you know, Mexico is market driven on their wages, and China is top down mandated driven. It's like a lot of the communist countries are.
Yeah, fair point. Okay, well, thank you all for answering that. And the final 2 points we wanted to leave you all with was one of the companies which are sourcing a product produced in Mexico with Mexican content. We talked earlier about the stainless steel. They're comparing that to their current suppliers to China, right? So they're basically bringing product in from Mexico, comparing it with China. The issue there is really it's a tough sourcing environment in Mexico, because the potential suppliers are overloaded with requests, and Mexico is not China. It doesn't have the supply chain base at all. And the final point is that companies which are sourcing products from Mexico that have imported products have got to go a little deeper, look at their cost structure. We're doing a lot of reports like that for our clients now, so that they can compare their costs in Mexico versus their costs in China as part of a kind of a global supply chain strategy. We are now at 12 o'clock. That we had a hard stop at 1 hour. For the questions we did not get to, we will get to after the webinar. And we want to thank you all very much for participating. So with that, we'll sign off, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.